and welcome back. Adobe recently released some updates for Lightroom and Photoshop 2024 with some new features based heavily on AI tools. And now's the chance to have a look at them and see if they're effective or are they just gimmicks. So let's dive in and take a look and see what I think. There are two new tools in Lightroom, both using this AI technology, and the first one is the generative remove tool, which is used to remove unwanted objects from an image, and the second one is the lens blur tool, and we'll cover that a little bit later. But firstly, the generative AI tool. To be able to use that, you must have the latest version of Lightroom, and if we go to the help section about Lightroom Classic, you need version 13.3 or later. So to engage these tools, you need to go to your toolbar menu, and you now have this remove tool. It's been renamed a little bit, and you have a remove tool, and you have options here to use generative AI. And the theory is that you paint on an area and it removes the object. Now, I've tried this one several times, and I have another version available, but basically you paint over the area you want removed, and the clever smarts within generative AI select the area, and I say, yes, that's what I want to take that away, and it'll generate three options just like the version in Photoshop does. And what I'm hoping for is it will just remove the person and leave the sky behind. But I've done this multiple times on this particular figure, and what I get is I get a ghostly figure and I get some sort of an animal left in the bottom of the image. And it gives you three variations. So if I click on the second variation, it's removed the person, sort of, but left this ghost behind, but no animal this time. And the third option, I've now got some sort of a wild cat, none of which I wanted in the photograph. And I can then refresh that and say, well, I really want another go at that. So it will again generate three more options for you. But knowing what I know from previously working on this, it's just generated a bird this time and another bird, and let's see what we get. Oh, and a dog. So in this instance, that tool there hasn't worked. So we could go back and say, well, let's turn off the generative AI and just use our good old remove tool and see what it does, and see if it does a better job. Well, it doesn't do a great job either. It's copied from here to there, but that's not really satisfactory. Let's go back in here. Let's not use the generative AI. Let's just try and remove this unwanted person and see what it comes up with. No, it doesn't do a very good job on this at all. So I'm not dismissing this out of hand because I have used it on some other parts in the image. Now let's just jump across to a virtual copy I made a little earlier, and here's another variation on that one that I made. But I had some figures over here that I removed, and if I just click on that selection and click on the little eye symbol here at the bottom of the panel and hold it, it shows me what's been removed. Now you'll see here that I've removed some people, and what it's done is it's filled in some rocks here and done quite a reasonable job. If I just zoom back out to full scale and turn that tool off so the outline isn't there, that's not too bad. And I had a third section on this image where I had some other figures that I wanted to get rid of. If I click on that again, here's the area I painted over. If I click and hold on the eye symbol, it's brought these people back, two people and a dog. And so in this case, it's done a very good job of removing them and filling in the background based on some of that generative AI technology. So this tool has its uses. It's very good in some things and not very good in others. And I think the tool in Photoshop probably works a little better, but at least in some cases it's going to work well for you. So by means of comparison, let's have a look at the same tool in Photoshop, which has been around for a couple of the latest revisions. And here's another scene taken in Edinburgh, and of course we've got the place full of tourists, and I want a nice clean image. And so what I've done is I've actually gone in and I've removed the bright blue rope handrail by just cloning it out. That was the easiest way to do that. But when it came to the people, then it gets a little bit more complicated. So what we would do then is we would use our selection tool, in this case just the lasso tool, and draw a selection around the people I want to remove, and say yes, I want those two people to go. I go to my generative fill toolbar and click on generate, and it should just remove those from the scene without any complications. And for multiple figures like this, I would do this over multiple times. And so it generates 3 options again, the same as we have in Lightroom now. And oh, interesting, I have a bride. Now that's interesting, that didn't happen last time. And then my second option is I have a spot of white paint on the ground, and I have another bride. Well, no, I don't want any of those, so let's go back and try that again. This is interesting because I just did it a few minutes ago and none of this happened. I just got a nice clean removal of the figures. So we'll just see what happens when we do it again. So that's one of the joys of working with these AI tools. Sometimes they work really well and sometimes they don't. So here we have what I was looking for, was just a clean removal of the figures from the scene. And it's done a pretty good job of matching up the textures and the background. And so what I did was I progressively worked my way around and removed all of those figures, and I cloned out the rope as well. And so in Photoshop, the tools work a little more consistently, but again, they're based on that same sort of technology. So the generative remove in Lightroom and Photoshop are based on fairly similar technology. I think the Photoshop one works a little better. It's a little more sophisticated, but again, it's one of those things you'll need to experiment with. And just popping back into Lightroom, here's another example of using these generative remove tools. This was at a series of old buildings where they demonstrated the old style Harris tweed weaving techniques, and there was this nasty rope running right through the middle of the image. So I selected that, and let's just click on it, painted over it, and did the remove, and it did a pretty good job overall. So I'm not dismissing this, but just bear in mind that you may get some slightly unusual results, so just persevere and try again with some more generations, and hopefully you'll come up with something that works quite well. So now, moving from the generative remove tool, let's have a look at the lens blur tool. Now, the second new tool that we have in Lightroom is the lens blur tool, and we'll just make this panel a little bit wider so we can see what we're doing. And it's accessed with its own panel. It's called lens blur, and this is an image I've decided I wanted to try and remove the depth of focus and make a quite simple image. So clicking on the lens blur panel, let's click on apply, and the software will analyze the image and try and work out a depth map for the image. Now, just be warned that this does take quite a lot of processing to generate this, and every time you open this image and then move on to another one, it will need to regenerate the lens blur, and it can take quite a while. But what it does, it's quite clever. If we click on the option here to visualize the depth in the image, it's worked out that these areas in the bottom here, colored yellow, are the nearest objects. Then we go through orange into red and into blue as things get further away from the camera. And we can see here with this slider, I can then move the slider to say, well, all I want in focus is the objects nearest me, which is this handrail. And if I expand that out further, you'll see that the focus depth of field goes all the way out. So it's quite a handy tool. We have different types of out of focus, and of course we have a slider for the amount of blur. Now let's just ramp things up a little bit, make it very blurry. We just want those first few things in the object here to be sharply in focus, and we can then paint on extra areas of focus or extra areas of blur but essentially it's a pretty handy tool to use, but it does take a lot of processing power. This computer has 64 gig of RAM and a fast processor, and it takes a while to generate. So let's go and have a look at another image I have. So the other image I have is one of everyone's favourite animal in Scotland, the sheep, and it was taken with the longish lens with the background reasonably out of focus. This is the original image, and then I made a virtual copy and applied that lens blur. Now if I click on that new one, it will generate the lens blur again, and it will take a little while before it actually comes on. Now in this image it probably doesn't need any extra lens blur, but this was a good example again, and it's still thinking about it. Now it's just applied the lens blur, and if I click off this image and go back to another one and come back to it, it's going to have to do that again. So there's a bit of a time delay in getting that lens blur to activate. And there's another bit of an unforeseen problem too. If I go to yet another image that I've worked on, and you'll see I've clicked on that and things are not happening, and we've got lens blur applied to this image, or we will have, where I've got a good range of focus from the foreground to the background, but I've already made a selection of the sky and darkened the sky down a little bit, and we're going to get into a little bit of trouble here because you need to do your lens blur before you do anything else on the image, as you'll see in a couple of seconds when this thing finally generates the lens blur. Well, we're thinking, waiting for it to happen. Oh, here we go. So here's the problem. I've applied some lens blur here, and I've kept the foreground. Let's turn the visualize depth on so that we can see what we're doing. So it's decided the foreground, middle ground, background, and if I want to start to change that depth of focus, turn that off, we'll start to see what happens. And again, it's grinding away in the background trying to recalculate, and I can stretch that area of focus out further and further. That's a nice tool to have. But what it's done in the background is that mask selection, and this is the other thing that happens, is it'll send your screen blank every now and then as it's trying to regenerate. Your mask is going to be blurred and you'll end up with a mess. So if you're going to use this lens blur tool, use it first before you do any other masking or selections on the image, because it just creates a lot of havoc. Personally, I think it's probably a little bit overrated. I think it has use in some images, but a lot of the time you're going to get the images pretty much right in camera anyway. But the lens blur tool takes a lot of processing power to generate the image. Let's go back and click on my famous sheep image again. There's the one without the lens blur, and if I click back on the one with the lens blur, it's going to have to regenerate that whole lens blur all over again every time I go into the image. So just be prepared. If you want to use this tool first before you do any other tonal adjustments. Let it do its blurring. Now it's picked up that blur, and if I just turn that off, and you see the screen goes blank every so often while it's thinking about it, and it will come back on. So now I turn that off and I allow it to come back on. It's going to think about it again before it comes back on. So it's a tool with some use, but be prepared for a bit of extra processing time. And there's one more tool in Lightroom that's been around for a little while, but I haven't covered it in a previous video, so I thought I'd just add it in here. And let's just find another image for me to work on, and we'll have a look at it. Let's choose this one here. This is another image from Scotland. It's had some processing applied to it, but there's one fundamental problem that applies to all image editing software, and that is, as we increase the contrast in an image, we tend to increase the saturation, which is, or as we darken an image, let's say, the image gets more saturated, which is the opposite to way our eyes operate. So that in this case, I've darkened this image down, and there you can see the saturation. If I just turn this off and on, you'll see that not only has it got darker, but it's become much more saturated. But on the curve tool, or the tone adjustment curve tool in Lightroom, you now have this option of a refine saturation slider, where you can actually pull back some of that gain in saturation. If I pull that all the way back to 0, let's just have a look at that. It gives you a bit more realistic. It's probably still got a bit of extra saturation, but it's better than going and working with this big increase, because otherwise you've got to go back up and make other adjustments. Now, I wouldn't be making a curve adjustment like this on this image. You'd probably add a bit of contrast, but the principle is that you've got this slider to refine the amount of saturation increase that you get with a tone curve adjustment. And it only works on the point curve version, not on the this one where you've got the highlight, shadows and other sliders. It's not available on there, so you have to go to the point curve, and there you have that slider. So there are the tools in Lightroom. Let's now jump into Photoshop and have a look at the new tool that they've added in Photoshop. So I've opened this same image in Photoshop, and let's have a look at this new adjustment brush tool. Now, I've put it on its own toolbar because as you'll see, I don't like this tool one little bit, but it would normally be found under the brush tool. And if you would need to have the latest version of Photoshop, which is 25.9.0, available to you, so that's what it is. But let's just pick up this adjustment brush tool, and by selecting that tool, it gives you some contextual tools up here. Let's just say these are the types of adjustments we can make. Let's just, for the sake of the argument, select a curves adjustment. I've got a fairly big brush, and what it does is it creates an adjustment layer for you. But of course, what it does is it just puts some crazy curve setting on, and as you paint on the image, it applies this curve. Well, I can't see the point of this at all, because firstly, I can do the same job much more easily by saying, let's just get the marquee tool, or even the quick selection tool, and select an area on the image, and then I can apply an adjustment layer to that. Let's just say it's a curve, and then I can do what I want with the curve. But with this brush tool, it creates an adjustment that's totally out of kilter with what you want to do on the image. And so you've got to go back and adjust it anyway. You might as well make your selection, or even simpler, just create an adjustment layer. Let's say curves adjustment layer. I want to lighten some of those darker areas. Let's just lighten the whole image, and I can just select the mask, invert the mask, go to my normal brush and paint on with white, and let's just say we've got fairly low opacity. I can then just choose where I'm going to paint in those adjustments, and I've got a much better control over it. I really can't see the point of this adjustment brush tool, because it just doesn't really do anything that I want to do to the image that I can't already do more quickly and more simply with the tools at hand. So you might find that it's different. So I've put it in a separate toolbar here, because I'm going to get rid of it, because it's of absolute no use to me. And so here we have some new tools in Lightroom and Photoshop. Let's just pop back to Lightroom for a second. We have the lens blur tool, which is of some use, and bearing in mind the processing time. We have the AI remove tool, which works well some of the time, and in Photoshop we have this adjustment brush. So probably 1.5 out of 3, I think, successful for this latest update in Photoshop. I wouldn't be using the adjustment brush at all in Photoshop, but I would be using the generative remove tool in Lightroom, even with its idiosyncrasies and its oddball things it throws up. It's still a very useful tool. So I hope that's all been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.